At the end of last year, right after Thanksgiving, my family had a huge medical emergency. Mama was down and it was not looking good. I shared the experience on social media, and the amount of support and prayers and comfort from you all was just overwhelming. We felt every single one, even though I couldn't respond to them all. But one thing I didn't share was actually what happened to Mama. And I want to share that today for two reasons. One, you may actually see yourself inside of this story, so you may empathize with the amount of trauma going on. And two, is to help us to become better advocates, not only for ourselves, but also for those that we love. So one day my mom went into the bathroom, and that's all that she remembers. What happened in that bathroom was really important. She fell over and she hit the tub. She came to, and she was in excruciating pain. Knowing that my mom has stage 3 cancer and she's 70 something years old, my dad took her to the hospital right away. The next time I hear from my dad, he's on his way back home. And I said, they didn't want to keep her? He said, no, she just has a fractured rib, and they gave her some little breathing thing so that way she can help to exercise her lungs. But that's just it. And I said to myself, well, that's kind of strange because it seemed like it was a pretty nasty fall, but okay. Fast forward 2 days later, and my mom was dead. And they were having to resuscitate her in another emergency room in another hospital. While the doctors were able to get a small heartbeat, they really weren't confident about her chances of survival. And so we were kind of preparing for that transition. But to make matters worse, they shared something to us that was so shocking. You see, my mom didn't have one fractured rib. She had 6 fractured ribs. Not only that, she had double pneumonia. And to add to that, she had sepsis. My mom's weight doubled in size and she was unrecognizable. It was shocking and graphic, to say the least, and it was completely devastating. Even just the memory of how my mom looked in the hospital was just so hard to bear. But it got me thinking, and it got all of us thinking during the next 55 days that she was in the hospital, trying to recover and fighting for her life. How in the world did the doctors miss this? How could you go from 1 to 6? How can you go from no pneumonia to double pneumonia? And what's worse, how could she have sepsis? Sepsis is pretty fatal, especially at her age and especially with her health conditions. So I reached out to a childhood friend who also happens to be a general physician to ask him, help me to make sense of what happened to my mom and what happens to others, because I found that when I shared my mom's story, others had very similar accounts. So today we sit down with Dr. Ahmad Price, who is the owner of GP Health, which focuses a lot more on patient advocacy for themselves and also collaborating with patients. He helps to add color and clarity to our collective healthcare experiences, and he touches on something that affects everyone. And that is implicit bias in healthcare quality. The conversation was so rich that we decided to break it up into 2 parts. Part 1 focuses on many of the challenges that we have in our current healthcare system regarding implicit bias and quality of care. This is part podcast, part storytelling, part breaking bread. This is At the Table.
There's fractures in our health system. And so me being the scholar that I am, I'm like, okay, so how do we seek to solve those? So I started saying, okay, we're treating folks too far downstream. They don't have an advocate. They're probably unaware that they are this far downstream, and we need to get further upstream. I said there's good medicine, there's bad medicine. Good medicine is we teach people how to be healthy to avoid disease, and when they do have disease, we teach them how to mitigate the effects on their life. Bad medicine to me is that we only just keep you in this cycle of being sick, and we don't educate you, we don't advocate for you, etc. Started GP Health, which is a primary care service and platform. We take more of a proactive, preventative focus to health through lifestyle. So it's really our distinct belief, and we'll get into data points later, that the power of health and longevity and vitality really resides in how we live our daily lives. I actually tell my patients all the time that you're the best doctor in the room, and that's what really GP Health is about.
So when did advocacy for patient care become really personal to you?
You know, I will say to a certain degree, it's always been personal. I try to treat patients like my family member and make the decisions that I would make for if Kevin was my brother. What would I do if my brother was in this scenario with good data in front of me? But I would say towards the end of my tenure at Baylor Scott and White before starting GP Health, my brother was diagnosed with a very rare condition, which he still has. It's called von Hippel-Lindau. So von Hippel-Lindau is this condition where you develop spontaneous tumors in different organ systems, mainly brain, eye, pancreas, liver, kidney. So we've since had multiple surgeries to remove tumors, and we're like always on high alert. Thank God he's in a much better place today. But when he started engaging with healthcare is when I started saying I knew about implicit bias. I knew about systemic racism. I knew about these things. You should also know my father's a physician, so nobody's immune to this, right? So we go to his first visit, and I won't say where, who it was with, and I just go to support. And I understand, I'm not the doctor. I should also say that tells the other doctor, hey, I'm a doctor. I let you do your thing. So I'm just sitting there observing the visit. Doctor happens to be a Caucasian male, and it's almost like he's being talked at. This is what we're going to do. And I'm like, in my mind, me being a physician, I was like, this is pretty high level stuff. And he clearly doesn't understand what's going on. He's just nodding, saying yes. And he doesn't feel empowered enough to engage in this dynamic and dialogue. I'm sitting back in that visit and I immediately say, okay, we have got to do something about this. I'm a firm believer as the mind goes, the body goes too. So that's where it started right then and right there. And there were several steps that I started to take to be an advocate for him.
In that moment, though, did you feel that your brother did not know what was going on and that it was much more of like a power dynamic going on, or did you feel that the doctor wasn't giving him the best care, or was it just like a boilerplate, like, all right, this, and this, and we're done here?
I think it was more of a boilerplate.
Okay.
And it wasn't that he wasn't getting the best. Wasn't that he wasn't getting the best care, but we should also say one other thing about von Hippel-Lindau. It's so rare.
Right.
Like you usually see it in, different like it's rare for an African-American male, black male to have von Hippel-Lindau. Mm-hmm. It's like, where did this come from? I say that to say that people don't see this a lot. And I should say that his care was running through my office. For example, it's like, oh, we'll follow up in 2 years. Like, no, we're going to follow up in 6 months. Just an example, because we were setting these parameters as we go. And I also felt that it was a confused emotion because I was actually, and I've told him this, I was kind of angry at him a little bit. But then I said, you know what? This is his first time kind of being in this position. He probably doesn't know what the hell he's been told. He has cancer.
Right.
Like, you just have to that's part of being an advocate, is being an advocate in the way that you're asked to be, and not what you think you should be. So I had to check myself on that one, honestly.
You said something. You said that as the doctor was talking there and you're sitting there, you had a lot of thoughts going through your head. But you said, I'm already aware of implicit bias and things like that and the disparities. What was going on that triggered that thought during that moment? Why was that a thought at that time?
So I'll be honest with you. I didn't have that thought at that moment. Hindsight is 20/20. And I was like, oh, this is how Black people die from cancer. And so what I mean by that is that, or certain groups have disparities in their outcomes. I realized he didn't have the knowledge.
Right.
So there's this concept of what we call an activated patient, and you can look at literature. And a lot of times, if you're taking agency and you participate in your own care and you come to that visit, when somebody has bias against you, bias being defined as, a certain predilection for certain groups or adverse reaction to other groups, you can disrupt that by being active in that care. So I said, you know what? We're going to educate ourselves on this condition. We're going to understand what von Hippel-Lindau is. Mm-hmm. We're going to understand what the treatment options are. And so notice I said, cancers appear everywhere. So you have to have this routine screening. And up to that point, people's like, oh, a year, 2 years. Well, in 3 years, you may not be here.
Right.
So, but if once we became activated, it was like, no, we're going to be at 6 months. And I believe to this day, this is why we're in the position that we're in. The second visit, we came with questions. We came with knowledge. We would say, okay, what's the expected plan? And I would say the root of advocacy is more or less, we are trying to obtain, and this is the demeanor that we took, we're trying to obtain the most amount of information internally, externally, to make the most informed decision. Mm-hmm. And we want to understand your thinking, and this is our thinking, and let's collaborate on this care. So, but a lot of times patients from different communities, ethnic backgrounds are not collaborated with. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the outcomes become worse.
So let me ask you this.
Mm-hmm.
So the doctor said 2 years and you said 6 months. Why wasn't 6 months suggested beforehand, just off jump, especially if they understand the gravity of the situation? In hindsight, do you think that if your brother was another type of patient, if your brother was a white patient, then do you truly believe that 2-year suggestion would be the same?
It's hard to say. I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, but I have seen more active and proactive approaches in other ethnic groups, just and I can only talk about my experience to a certain degree
Right.
as a physician, but also those groups come in, this whole concept of activated patient, come in with that, I'm not going to say demand, but with that ethos. So the response from the caregiver is distinctly different. Not to mention, sometimes these people will say indigent patients, but we'll just say our more vulnerable populations don't quite know how to advocate for themselves, don't quite know how to do, not necessarily speak the lingo, but how to achieve the desired result in there. Not to mention, those groups are often cast off and kind of talked to when we talk about this patriarchal instead of collaborated with.
Yeah.
And that's health equity, honestly.
Do you think so, that the answer or the recommendation would have been different if your brother was a white man?
Probably so.
And that's just based off of, again, like what you've seen like over time. This is, but I'm pretty sure there's data out there, right? There's data out there on disparities in healthcare quality and care.
We have raw numbers on, say, like cancer rates, right? Mm-hmm. We'll use cancer, so we're talking about cancer. Like cancer rates amongst African Americans, if you look at the raw number, are not as high as other ethnic groups, but where you have the issue is that the outcome is a lot worse. Yeah. So then you have to say, okay,
that stands out.
Where is the breakdown? Mm-hmm. And I think the U.S. healthcare system is just now reaching a point to where we're starting to address health equity. We're starting to ask why questions. We're starting to be more proactive in our approach of understanding this. And I will also say that's one of the reasons I started GP Health, is that could no longer kind of sit by in that system. Is like, okay, we have to design a better solution here, but we need to acquire more through the lens of the issue that we're trying to solve, which is a poor outcome. Let's get lost in the weeds between the rates and the outcome. Why is that?
Help me to understand this. It's a little bit more. Like, I don't understand this whole idea where, like, if you know that the best recommendation for somebody is to say 6 months to check back in, why would you even say like 2 years? I feel like our patients and people humanize at the same rate, the same level, based off of race, based off of income, based off of other variants. And you look at the cost of healthcare. You look at the cost of healthcare. I believe the U.S. is like the highest healthcare cost in the world. Yeah, but to have but you kind of expect the least, in a sense, in many ways, because I kind of feel like doctors operate with their hands tied behind their backs, in a sense. Like, they operate out of a place of fear. Like, I don't want to get sued. I don't want this to go bad. So I'm just going to just give generic advice and collect these payments and do the churn and burn. There's really not like a huge incentive for doctors, other than I don't want to lose my license. So I'm going to operate much more in a blanket sense. Like, when and how can we hold doctors accountable for that piece? And at the same time, I say that I also feel bad, and I feel empathetic for doctors. Mm-hmm. Like, you work for 20 plus years or so to get here, and one mistake could cost you that. So the system is really broken.
That in and of itself, functional medicine is the root cause issue. The most vulnerable population should have the resources to care for their unique issues, and it should be designed like that. So to me, a lot of the problem is in design. Yeah. And then I would say, as a passionate physician, think about it. You train 20 years for one thing, and then you get there and it's not what you thought it was. Mm-hmm. And then you see everybody suffering. Imagine how you feel.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's like, man, I may have just wasted a lot of years, because I have truly thought about leaving medicine at certain points, but it's my talent, it's my gift. And I feel that if I can design something better, you notice I said design. Mm-hmm. There's a reason I said design, because it is not designed for what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's the root cause issue. It's not designed for that. It's not designed for equity. It's not designed for access. Fee for service is designed for that. Yeah. And so that's why you have this very fractured system that, when it is stressed, takes an inordinate amount of toll on the most vulnerable populations. Look no further than the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
Because, our system with stress shouldn't cause harm to the most vulnerable of the populations, but the way it's designed, that's how it happens. So a lot of this, to me, goes back to design, where we have these communities that we know are insecure in so many ways. We need to have better structures in place, and that's not a call out in my industry, but just in my industry, we need to have better structures in place to deal with where the biggest need is. And unfortunately, we do not. Yeah, that's the hard truth.
So after every episode and sit down we have, Jesse and I will debrief. We'll listen to the episode in its entirety and pull out what we feel are the most important parts for storytelling. And rather than doing this part off camera, we decided to react in real time with you all as you listen to this episode, because the conversation is just so rich, and so is the material. So Jesse, this is the first time I've actually heard him talk about, or I've even heard the term, an activated patient. So I went and looked that up. Have you heard that before?
Yeah, he sent you studies, right?
For the purpose of this conversation, I found the study that he was talking about, and it's one that was published in August of 2022, and it says patient activation reduces effects of implicit bias on doctor-patient interactions. Now, what's interesting about this study we see is that they had two groups. And the doctors were always unassuming. The doctors had no idea, what was going on. So what they did with the patients, and this is for cancer, people go in to visit these doctors who all assume that they have some sort of advanced cancer. So for half of the patients, they tell the patients just to be their typical selves. And the other patients, they were the activated patients. So they were encouraged to ask questions, to get involved, to see if implicit racial bias was actually a factor. The implicit racial bias was associated with the ones who were just very typical, who didn't ask questions, who did not engage. When they were engaged and activated, the doctor's implicit bias had no effect on the interpersonal treatment. I think this explains a lot of what happened with my mom. I could see her care got better once we began to advocate and become a lot more collaborative with the doctors.
Begs the question, why wouldn't you just get that care from the start? Yeah.
From the start.
Yeah.
Right. So when you look at the case of my mom, once we actually pulled her emergency room record, mm-hmm. So when they first went in, the one there where they just discharged her,
yeah.
What the record said was equally shocking. They said 70-year-old woman comes in and she appears uncomfortable. And that seems like, well, why? How does somebody appear uncomfortable? Either she's in pain. Yeah. She fell. Her husband said that she fell.
Yeah.
She doesn't have any idea how she fell.
Yeah.
But she's in pain. But she appears that way. And it's kind of like if your daughter were to come to you and be like, I'm sick. And you said, she looks like she could be sick, and I'm just going to send her to school anyway because she may be trying to get out of this because I know that she hates these days because today is PE day or something, right? Or that's your own bias that's coming into there, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, what if they looked at her and be like, "Oh, she's sick. She says she's sick. Well, let me just keep her home just out of caution."
Yeah.
So that way I can monitor her. So they said that about my mom, and then they said that she had belabored breathing. So you would think you broke a rib, fractured a rib.
Something's going on.
Right.
She's not breathing the same way she was before.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, my dad's not asking any questions, but they put in the file, oh, well, she's obese. Right after that, they said she has belabored breathing. She's also obese.
Implying that that's the reason why.
She's just a fat black woman.
Yeah.
That's in pain.
Yeah.
And then it goes on to say that I shot her up with morphine. I gave her a shot of morphine. She seemed to respond to that. Then I asked her if she wanted to stay, and she said no. So I released her.
Okay. Well, I mean, everyone's going to respond well to morphine. Like, it's a numbing agent of all sorts. Like,
who knew? Right?
Yeah.
I really get where this is coming from because that whole interaction was based off of bias. And to that point, when we had other doctors look at her file, the doctors, first thing they said was, without even knowing our racial background, because we had independent doctors kind of look at this and they were passing it around. And they said, oh, we see this very often with a lot of black patients. They think that they're trying to score drugs. So they just shoot you up with more
a stereotype right off the bat. Just,
right.
Yeah. Okay.
Give her the drugs and she'll be fine.
That's frustrating.
And send her home. But what if my dad kind of knew the questions to ask?
You know, we're taught to trust the professionals, right? And so it's like, why would I ask questions? Like, why would I, they know what they're doing. And then all of a sudden you're presented with something that feels really wrong. And you have to trust your gut and say like, well, hold on. Why wasn't she kept longer? Why wasn't more stuff? Like, she's not a kid that fell over. She's a 70-year-old woman
with stage 3 cancer,
stage 3 bone and blood cancer. Like, there's more than enough reason there to check out further and to keep her overnight at least and run tests, like minimum, right?
I was curious to see if this was the same too with socioeconomic status, and there's quite a bit of research out there. I went to the NIH, National Institute of Health, all the studies about socioeconomic status and how it influences healthcare practices. It says healthcare disparities are influenced by how a person's SES, socioeconomic status, is perceived by themselves and by others. These perceptions affect people's attitudes and beliefs, and these subsequently emerge as implicit biases, which are held by patients and health professionals equally. It's not as linear to show that, okay, that there's bias out there, right? But when you look at the rate at which things happen to populations, like for instance the cancer, perhaps it doesn't happen within the black community to that same level, to that same degree for this particular type of cancer. However, when the population gets it, the outcomes are a lot worse. Like you said, you put so much care and trust in your medical professionals to provide the best care. Yeah. So why wouldn't they do that on day one? But you look at other instances of our society where you see that there's an incongruence in the way that some groups are treated than others. So to me, as I'm even looking at this and reading this, also in the back of my head, I'm thinking, well, why would you think this is going to be any different over here, Kev?
Yeah.
Why would you think that implicit bias would not be a factor? It's an implicit bias. There's implicit bias in a lot of other areas in life that we talk about.
Yeah, totally. It's the reason why the dialogue has to happen around like why we have to be like anti-racist because of stuff like this, right? Like, it's not one thing to just not be racist. It's good to point out and advocate for people that are still not being treated the same way.
Right.
And it comes down to even like now I'm thinking, okay, when I go to the doctor, no matter what, I still need to ask questions.
Yeah.
Just because, not because I'm black, but because this is how the system works. And this is just what's natural for these doctors to do. They tend to be, even from our conversation, it's like they struggle with a numbers game, right? Like in these hospitals and stuff. So it's good to just be proactive and ask those questions and get ahead of it to make sure you're receiving the best care possible.
It's also the tragedy of, the person who cried wolf. There's so many people that cry wolf that when actually somebody actually needs help.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, it's
Yeah.
probably the same thing. So I bet that also is, you know,
The system lends to errors to be made.
yeah.
And then on top of that, you have to deal with implicit bias as well. And so it's a formula that doesn't seem like it's working very well.
So what do you think about this part where he was talking about the different approaches according to different ethnic groups? And he says something to the effect of like, the whole concept of an activated patient comes into mind, that like some patients, I'm not going to say demand, but they kind of demand with this ethos. So the response from the caregiver is really different, is distinctly different. What did you think about that? I was like, I read something immediately.
Pulling that Karen card. Like
That was full Karen.
Oh, man.
And let me tell you, I want to speak to the manager of cancer.
Yeah, it became a meme for a reason, though.
But you know, in this scenario, though,
it warrants it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, because at the end of the day, it's
your loved one.
Life or death.
Yeah.
Like,
it's your loved one. And so I appreciated him kind of just, it was a really political and great way of saying that some groups kind of activated patient comes to mind. They're very activated. Then I'm not going to say demand.
Yeah. To use that one in your relationship, you're being a little too activated right now.
Oh.
Let's see how that goes for you.
You know, it's probably going to get you that, you know, like just that pass the first time being
It'll
like,
be fine. And then later on, I'll be like, wait, what did you mean by that? Yeah.
But to contrast that, though, he says in that same sentence, though, when you see vulnerable populations who don't do that, you see their health outcomes are quite different.
Yeah.
So to your point, it's a meme for a reason. It's efficient for a reason.
Right.
It works for a reason. As part of the research for this episode, I reached out to my parents to ask them questions about this entire experience and what they remembered. Some stories I remembered, and some stories I had never heard before, like this one about how a nutritionist stepped in to become an advocate for my mom in a very critical time of care. What'd they say?
They were asking me about procedures. Did I want this done or did I want that done? I says, I don't know. You're the professional. I want the best care for me. You need to, and I always refer to them, call my husband.
It's probably when they were trying to decide whether they were going to put that tube in her stomach or not after taking it out of her mouth. And only she had a good dietitian, nutritionist, to say, no, she may not need that tube. Let's just see how she does with trying to take the food, ingest the food on her own.
Yeah.
They were definitely headed to doing that tubing.
Really?
They came to the room twice to do it, and her numbers were not good on that day, on those 2 days to do it. The next day she upgraded her menu, and the next day she upgraded her menu, and Janice was taking the food very well. And so she says, we don't need that tube in her stomach. She's not choking on the food or anything like that. I'm going to broaden her diet to fully available. Whatever she wants to eat, they just have to cut it up.
In part 2, the final part of our series on implicit bias in healthcare and advocacy in healthcare, we picked Dr. Price's brain on what we can do to advocate for ourselves and for our loved ones. That's it for today. Catch up on earlier episodes of At the Table wherever you choose to get your podcasts, and you can also watch full episodes on youtube.com/fitmencook. And for daily inspiration, follow Fitman Cook on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Until next time, keep it healthful but never ever boring. Boom!